Patty was at some of those dinners. Joseph Duan.
Unfortunately, those are long lines.
Yes. But some of them we actually quotes where and it's spelled Portland. Oops. Letter to a friend.
Actually, a friend of mine who wants to have that. I don't know how far to go.
So obviously the first thing that I'll take issue with is your assumption that there is a canonical narrative at all. I have a lot of friends within the art history world who beat themselves up about being Eurocentric. And I always tell them, please come to India and I'll show you a bunch of people who are very Indocentric. It's very natural for everybody to be very centered on their own location and to see the world from that perspective. And so for me, from India, let's say what I imagine you might be thinking of as the canonical art history, to me is extremely regional and even provincial. For me, there is nothing more provincial than abstract expressionism.
I suppose you have to do it primarily by keeping alive the fact that all of these terms, the canonical, the local, the regional, are in themselves in tension and are evolving and changing categories. The thing is that, I personally think that the way in which the canonical structure or canons themselves are problematized has led to an opposite reaction with which I don't necessarily agree, which is to decanonize or to eliminate the need for a canon. I think that there is a continuous need for a canon, if for no other reason than to be able to disagree with it.
I think this question very much relates to how we write about history. So what kind of narrative tools can we devise to some extent, write sometimes from scratch histories which are very much fragmented or yet to be written. So in the case of South Asia, this very much means decolonizing our narrative tools for the purposes of history writing. So this is a type of project which involves the kind of playful dynamic set up by people like Dipesh Chakrabarti and Rustom Barucha and Ranajit Guha, who are, key figures in the subaltern movement, whose project has been one of dismissing or to some extent reassessing and marginalizing the centrality of the construct of Europe as this normative kind of center from which we write history.
By definition, for me, the incorporation of other areas of the world besides the Euro-American center means redefining what art is. And so that's the crucial distinction. Which redefinitions of art do we find in Japan, or which redefinitions of art are available in Bulgaria, which redefinitions of art are available in Iran? And by opening up the door as widely as possible, I believe that we will come to potentially a redefinition of art that is akin to the redefinition of art in my personal experience. There's a redefinition of art that took place within Russia and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, in which virtually all of the art that was displayed went to storage. And virtually all of the art that was seen by no one became the art that goes in museums.
In a lot of research that I've been doing, I've been fascinated by the fact that a lot of artists who were poets, who were theorists, who were teachers, who were travelers, who did all kinds of things in their life as artists, start to narrow down a definition of art based on a certain idea of a canon, which is only about making paintings or making sculptures or making installations and all of those other things. It's not like they don't continue to happen. It's just that they get cast somewhere else in some other trajectories. So my feeling is, with regard to the canon, it has to be received from ground up. One has to read them from ground up. How is a set of practices reading into a canon? How does it then start absorbing the canon? And how does that start reflecting in the field? And so if one were to treat it the other way around, in a canon and how it dictates cultural production, it might end up being a narrative which is either derivative or how someone was inspired by a canon from somewhere else. Whereas if you start looking from ground up, you find a much more rich practice.
I think any assimilation of the marginal narrative into the dominant one, it also requires the revisions into this main dominant narrative, which is, of course, of ideological nature, very often where this continuity of the Western world is coming from and why the histories of other worlds are constantly disrupted, as Zdenka Badovinac would say. She did the exhibition called Interrupted Histories. Or Impossible Histories. That was the title of the book about the Yugoslav neo-avant-garde that Miško Košovaković edited, or similar examples. But all these examples are the kind of ideas that map the problems that are put on the table and can be further used for the further research and think tanking about what is the possible next step out of that.
Good evening. I'm Glenn Lowry, Director of the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this celebration, really, of a decade of CMAP, that is, Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives in a Global World. This program was a new program for the Museum of Modern Art on several levels. The first is that it was designed to be a research program. And that may seem straightforward and simple, but the museum before had actually thought of research as almost quasi-independent of the scholarship that our curatorial staff and others at the museum conducted. And we wanted to create something that was embedded in the very practice of being a scholar at the museum. Our trustees at the time tasked Kathy Hallbreich, who had just joined us as the associate director, and myself, was thinking about how we could also be a good or a constructive colleague at a global level with other institutions, artists, curators, critics around the world that might be interested in exploring common issues with us. And out of that desire to create a research-based initiative central to the museum that also afforded us the opportunity to think and work with colleagues at a global scale came CMAP. And when we took this on, we also realized that the idea of being global was a chimera. We did not have the resources, nor the time, nor in the end really the expectation that we could be everywhere at once, at scale, working with appropriate artists, colleagues, critics. So we realized very quickly that what we needed to do was to commit ourselves to working in certain areas for a prolonged period of time so that we could build the relationships, the knowledge, and the ability to continue working in those areas even after our interests might have migrated somewhere else. And so the initial concept was that we would commit ourselves to working in 3 regions for at least 3 years. And in fact, we stayed with that for much longer. And those regions of initial interest were Latin America, which made a lot of sense given the museum's pre-existing interest in Latin America and extensive collections. Eastern Europe, and particularly post-war, post-Second World War, Eastern Europe, and Asia, and specifically Japan in the 50s and 60s. And we brought together at the time 3 counselors to help us think through how we might frame this. Homi Bhabha, Mika Bal, and David Jocelyn. And they were instrumental in the early construction of a platform for the museum. Then, through the support of the Mellon Foundation, for which we are profoundly grateful, we were able to add postdoc and graduate fellows to amplify the research capacity here at the museum. And by research, I mean, and I meant specifically when we proposed this to the trustees, what in the sciences might be called theoretical research as opposed to applied. No expectation that this research would lead to anything other than creating strong relationship with colleagues around the world and increasing our own knowledge and sensitivity to those regions. It was not driven by a desire to increase acquisitions at the museum, or to expand our publication program, or to enhance our exhibition program. It was really about how can we learn more about parts of the world that we felt it was critical to understand, and how could we, in an act of reciprocation, ensure a conversation with colleagues across many disciplines from whom we knew we had a lot to learn. The reality, of course, is if you ask any group of curators to think about post-war Eastern Europe or Latin America, they will eventually arrive at acquisitions that they are yearning to make, or publications that they feel are essential to do, or exhibitions that have to be done. So despite the continued commitment to research qua research, there's also been a remarkable benefit in terms of dozens of publications that have been produced, especially the monographic anthologies that have helped key texts that are often in languages not easily available to be brought together, translated into English, and then disseminated, and often retranslated back into original source languages, precisely because the source texts were so hard to find. Literally, probably at this point, I'm going to guess, close to 500 to 1,000 works of art acquired as a result of CMAP-based research, and dozens of exhibitions. So the side benefit of conducting this research has been enormous. But what remains for me essential, and I think what was critical to Kathy in her shaping of some of these ideas, is that research as research that engages artists and critics and scholars and curators and archivists and educators and conservators in a conversation about art enables all of us to learn and benefit from each other. And behind that capacity to do so lies one of the most extraordinary figures at the Museum of Modern Art, Jay Levenson, the director of our international program, who wove together these many strands and continues to weave them together and to ensure that the work happens, and that's no easy task. We were lucky that our international council saw the benefits of this program and immediately came to its support and they continue to support this. We were equally lucky that Patty Cisneros was so excited about the research that was being done on Latin America that it motivated her to create the Patty Cisneros Center for Latin American Art here at the Museum of Modern Art, a research-based program that grows directly out of this. And so what started as a little idea about how to engage in the world in a new and different way for us has already had many terrific benefits. And so now as we celebrate 10 years, it's a pleasure to turn the podium over to Jay Levenson. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Glenn. The clips you just saw on the screen, like others we're going to play from time to time over the weekend, were drawn from a series of videos on our website, Post, based on interviews we conducted with CMAP guest speakers in 2016 and 2017. As Glenn noted, we started the program in 2009 with the Asia, Latin American, and Eastern Europe groups. Each of the groups is headed by a MoMA curator who's assisted by a fellow, and the participants include over 60 staff members from our curatorial education, publication, exhibition, library, archives, and conservation departments. The groups have focused on a variety of countries within the respective regions. They hold workshops at MoMA, usually twice each month, generally at lunchtime, which makes it easier for our curators to attend. We offer lunch. And to which they bring curators, scholars, and artists to discuss their areas of knowledge. Each year, every group makes a trip to the region it's studying, and once each year we hold a seminar like this one, but usually on a smaller scale, on the subject of common interest to all the groups. More recently, we've added an African group to the program, and as Glenn mentioned, our Latin American group is actually becoming a part of the Patricia Cisneros Research Institute for the Study of Latin American Art, which itself is an exciting development. So as Glenn mentioned, over the past 10 years, CMAP has given its members the opportunity not only to look deeply into particular regional histories, but also to reflect more generally on what the category of global means. So in this seminar, building on the decade of research that we've devoted to the art histories of particular places, we'll be looking to think across geographies and to approach the global not as an abstract category, but more as a methodology for comparisons, a way of considering similarities and differences in art from different parts of the world. So this year's symposium has been organized by our 3 CMAP fellows, Pradna Desai, Megan Forbes, and Iberia Perez-Gonzalez, working closely with Sarah Lukowski, Associate Director of the International Program. Martha Dancy and Nene Diallo in the International Program have provided invaluable help. And we're, of course, deeply indebted to our distinguished speakers, some of whom have traveled very far to be here, for so generously sharing their knowledge with us. Now, we were inspired by the name of the CMAP program itself, so we chose the symposium's title, The Multiplication of Perspectives, in the plural, to emphasize the multiple perspectives that have to be taken into account when approaching histories of art internationally. To some extent, we'll be addressing past CMAP research, but we're also engaging new speakers and creating new dialogues. Each session is structured around a series of conversations, and taken as a whole, they're intended to address different ways of thinking about what the global means as an interconnected space through histories of transaction, exchange, and domination, as being composed of incommensurable parts, or as a reality that has taken form right here in New York. We're delighted to begin the symposium with our keynote speaker, Zdenka Badovinac, who is a longtime friend of the international program. She participated in a launch event in Prague for our very first primary documents publication on Eastern Europe, and that was back in 2004. More recently, she's been a CMAP speaker, and of course, our CMAP members have on various occasions visited the Moderna Galerija, the remarkable museum that she directs in Ljubljana. So I'd like to call on Megan Forbes, our CMAP Fellow for Central and Eastern Europe, to introduce Zdenka. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, and I'll just start by echoing a few of his thanks and adding a couple more. I'd like to thank Sarah Lukowski for really spearheading the conceptualization and organization of this program. Thanks as well, of course, to Iberia Perez and Pradna Desai for their ideas and inputs that the 4 of us helped put this event together. I'm especially grateful to Iberia and Pradna for sharing their intellectual labor and love over the past 2 years as fellows, and I've learned so much from the both of you. A shout out to Marta Dancy for keeping the ship running, to Kara Caraccio and to Nene Diallo, our new CMAP coordinator, who hit the ground running, helping us to finalize this program. Thanks as well to our spring intern, Hannah Halalai, who I think is watching us at home from Kosovo. Hi, Hannah. And truly, it takes a whole community of folks to make a symposium like this run. I want to express our appreciation for the AV team, those unseen heroes in the projection booth, and to graphics and digital media department for managing the online and print presence of this symposium. Thanks as well to security and housekeeping for helping to keep everything moving smoothly. Thank you to John McDonald for keeping this museum networked via the post. And I'm also grateful to Jenny Tobias in the library for supporting so much of the research of this program. I hope you'll all have the opportunity at some point to take advantage of the many new volumes we've purchased in preparation for this symposium. Of course, my thanks to all the MoMA staff who are participating in the coming sessions over this weekend, and a debt of gratitude is also, of course, due to all who will be sharing their intellectual and artistic insights with us this weekend. And for this evening, it is my honor to introduce the director of the Moderna Galerija in Ljubljana, Zdenka Badovinac. So Badovinac took up the position of director during the years of Yugoslav secession. In the 2.5 decades since, she has been a powerful voice from the so-called former East in articulating her position for artists from post-socialist Europe within the contemporary global art infrastructure. In 2006, Badovinac curated the exhibition Interrupted Histories, which we've now all heard about thanks to Eda Čufer, which foregrounded the work of artists from Eastern Europe and, to a lesser extent, the Middle East. And in her accompanying catalog essay, she asked, quote, "What are the implications of the absence of systematic historicization in spaces outside or on the margins of the West? How might the processes of such historicization be accelerated?" Badovinac is amongst a group of curators and artists in Central and Eastern Europe that have actively been working to resituate and inscribe a history of art that accommodates artistic production in countries like the former Yugoslavia into larger art histories, while at the same time maintaining a critical stance towards this process. After all, what is large and what is small is determined by always unequal power relations operating at the level of the global all the way to the hyper-local. It is a question worth pausing on to ask, as Badovinac does warily in Interrupted Histories, quote, "With the globalization of capital comes the globalization of the Western art system. Now, after a decade and a half of this process, we are asking ourselves, just what sort of modernization is this?" It is a refreshing ambivalence. The willingness of Badovinac to look directly at the icky stuff is also reflected in a new essay that appears in a recent volume bringing together 2 decades of her writings, Comradeship, Curating Art and Politics in Post-Socialist Europe. Titled My Post-Catastrophic Glossary and illustrated by Nika von Ham, in the first image, the artist and museum director are sitting casually in front of the ruins of the Moderna Galerija. It is a moment to start from scratch with, quote, "No museums, no careers, no documenta, no Venice, no competition over prestige, no funding, no government, just a bloody fight for survival with no hypocrisy or masquerades." There could be a whole dissertation on the genealogy of the use of the word "no" in art history, and maybe there is. But for me, all these negations conjure the collective Dada manifesto of 1918 and its cluster of the repeated word 999. I have been thinking since 2016 presidential elections that we are living in a Dada moment, where sometimes words are not enough to express what it is we want to say, are insufficient to make amends or articulate our grief, where I fear a whole lot more no's and no mores will be uttered or made material before we get somewhere better. So I think it is fitting and honest that a book called Comradeship and published in 2019 should end with the post-apocalypse. And I think it is also fitting to kick off this weekend's symposium with the site of this metaphorical rubble, as Badovinac writes candidly that the Moderna Galerija has, quote, "confronted its own traumas and complicities, its instrumentalization by capitalism and ideology, its imbrication in hegemonic systems of knowledge," end quote. These are some of the issues I hope we will face head-on in the coming days through a variety of lenses, reflecting a modality of the sustainable museum that invites diverse constituents, embraces contextualizations, allows for multiple and simultaneous narratives, and reckons with, embraces even, incommensurabilities. So please join me in welcoming Zdenka Badovinac to the stage to get us started on that path.
Thank you, Megan, for this wonderful introduction. and thank you, Jay, for inviting me. It has been a great pleasure to be a member of this big group of CMAP. So I will be talking about global things, of course. Today, what unites cultural producers and artists from different parts of the world is the fact that we all work under global conditions. And what are these global conditions? Global capitalism, the internet, global warming, and so on are certainly the part of the definition, but these things in themselves do not tell us very much if they are not understood in relation to the local spaces that are being transformed by such global conditions. What is more, it is only in the context of the concrete local environment that it becomes clear that these global conditions are of greater benefit to some and less benefit to others. They benefit those who already wield power, while others can only struggle against global domination. But what is true of both groups is the fact that they need transnational networks of allies in order to operate. And these networks can be quickly replaced by new ones. The only constant is the networks themselves, the networks as dominant mode of contemporary operation. The question I wish to discuss in my presentation is how much does our growing tendency to work in networks contribute to alienation of our language? Or is the very opposite happening? Are these networks, with their different collaborations, actually returning the body to language? The art world today depended on various networks, and not just the networks through which art crafts circulate, but now, even more importantly, networks of information and knowledge. Art world networks involve an entire army of experts from around the world. And thanks to new technology, this knowledge is now more accessible to everyone, as we know. But the problem and inconsistency of these networks is that they are still much too closely tied to the central producers and their sources of funding, and consequently, so is the accumulation and processing of knowledge, which then takes place in accord with their protocols and priorities. Such networks would be more equitable if they were made up of a large number of self-assured producers from a variety of cultural environments. But it would be too idealistic to expect this given that there is nothing close to an equal level of development among local conditions. In European Union, there are many efforts to make its different regions more equal in these terms. That is possible to receive funding for different cultural projects if co-producers from different EU countries are working together. Such EU funding programs have positive influence on a region's economic development by connecting cultural projects with investments in infrastructure and even with employment. Among other things, their goal is to form a common European cultural space. Europeans themselves, however, have very different ideas about what this means based on their different historical experience and present situation. Nor does the current picture of Europe, with its growing nationalism, populism, and even fascism, show much success in developing the common cultural space. There is also the fact that Europe is divided between the EU and non-EU countries, which have not yet met its criteria for membership. The Schengen border runs along Slovenia's southern border. I hope you know a little bit about, of course, former Yugoslavia and Slovenia being its northeast westernest part. So the Schengen border runs along Slovenia's southern border, which thus separates a borderless Europe from the other countries of former Yugoslavia. Cultural projects in countries that are not part of the EU must then depend primarily on national budgets. And almost as a rule, the poorer these countries are, the more state money is spent on developing newly devised nationalistic histories. In the Balkans, radical nationalism goes hand in hand with strong historical revisionism, which means in particular erasing all positive aspects of socialist period and demonizing it. The most extreme example is Macedonia, now called North Macedonia, where enormous sums of money have been spent on megalomaniac nationalist monuments and museums. A few years ago in Skopje, the capital, where the national museums of modern and contemporary art are literally falling apart, some new museums were built, including Museum of Macedonian, the Macedonian struggle of sovereignty and independence, also called Museum of the Victims of Communist Regime, which distorts this socialist history to such a degree that it reduces it to nothing but violence against those who were fighting for national independence. So this is from the museums, and these are contemporary artworks that you can see painted by, it's very interesting, Russian painters. So the museum invited the Russian painters to depict the nationalist Macedonian history. Modernist architecture, which was recently presented in the frame of the exhibition here in MoMA. So this modernist architecture built under socialism is today covered by pseudo-classical facades, as if to stress the idea that socialism was a deviation from the path of a great European culture. A similar historical revisionism is happening also in countries within the Schengen borders. One of the worst examples of such revisionism is taking place in Hungary, where plans are being made for a monument of national unity in Budapest to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Trianon in 2020. This will be a 100-meter long plaque on which will be written the historical Hungarian names of 12,000 municipalities, both those that are today still in Hungary and those now belong to other countries, but were once in Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These include the names of Croatian, Vojvodinian, Slovak, and even Slovenian towns and villages. It is frightening the way nationalism in Europe in the recent years has taken the form of territorial threats, reminiscent of the 1930s. As we know, Hungary was also the first country to set up a razor wire fence on its southern border to keep out refugees, but not long afterwards, Slovenia, with the tacit support of Brussels, followed its example. In Slovenia, which has been a member of the European Union since 2004, and is geographically the westernmost country on the territory of former Yugoslavia, people tend to mock the new Macedonian Disneyland and take much less extremist positions when it comes to safeguarding of the national heritage. But even here, there are those who would like to skip past of the country's post-war socialist history. For many, the independent country of Slovenia, founded in 1991, represents, among other things, the victory of Slovenian language and national culture. But what they fail to see in this connection is the fact that here a different logic began to dominate, the logic of foreign investors and transnational capital. The financial policies of the EU are also dominated by International Monetary Fund. This was evident particularly during the recent financial crisis, which led to drastic reductions in the national budgets for culture. In addition, local authorities often seize on the opportunity to acquire European Union resources without, however, coordinating this with their own priorities or missions of the institutions. We are one of these examples. So let me illustrate this using my own museum as an example, namely the Museum of Contemporary Art, Metelkova, or Museum, how we pronounce. The museum, which houses the artist's 2000 plus collection, the Eastern European collection, operates as a part of the Moderna Galerija, a national institution. We opened Museum in 2011, that is to say, right in the middle of the recent economic crisis. Although we received EU regional development funds for the museum, our national government failed to designate any money for the museum's program, which meant in practice that we began our work in our museum with no money for exhibitions or even running costs, such as water and electricity. So the architecture of the museum, so the museum is actually the architecture, it's a renovated former Yugoslav army barracks. So the picture before showed the original situation in 2000, and this is already the renovated thing. So the architecture of the museum, meanwhile, was determined almost more by the deadlines and an inflexible financial framework than by content of our program. This bureaucratic logic left the building with a large number of non-logical features, which we, its users, are still trying to fix. Artists, too, are helping us. For example, we invited the Croatian artist, Marko Sančanin, for instance, who has been making corrections to useless infrastructures, senseless fittings, and poorly defined spaces to which he gives new meaning. He does this not by providing them with any new content. Rather, Sančanin simply observes the things that happen spontaneously in this sense. For example, one such pointless area in the basement has been colonized by the cleaning staff, who take refuge there during the day to enjoy their coffee in peace. Spaces like this quiet corner, Sanchanin calls crypts, that is, spaces with no clear purpose where things can happen that are possibly not allowed or least not defined in the official program or the mission of the museum. These crypts then mark spaces without names. So the spaces where museum can be reinterpreted itself over and over. And in our context, what might such reinterpretation mean? I explain it as a re-examining how much certain language is still appropriate for a specific reality. We live in time of extremes, a time of not only strong global and transnational interconnections, but also virulent forms of nationalist hatred towards everything that is foreign. While the transnational networks use a language that is ever more generalized and not intended solely for specific spaces, the jargon of nationalism is populist and adapted to local needs, and local populations have no troubles understanding it. The transnational art world like to think of itself as progressive, as constantly engaging in the battle against neoliberal capital, against existing canons, and for greater justice in general. The art world is dominated by leftist jargon and filled with the words like anti-global, anti-liberal, decolonial, the common good, etc. The ideas these words describe have led to numerous exhibitions, articles, and conferences, and also shape the way museums are supplementing their collections. With so many projects of this sort, which have diverse and sometimes even ideological opposed producers standing behind them, these words are becoming more and more abstract and frequently degenerate into trendy buzzwords. One of the core questions that art and its institutions must address today is how to bring back the work and language from which we feel alienated. This is something the Italian Marxist theorist and activist Franco Bifo Berardi writes about. In his book, The Uprising on Poetry and Finance, he notes that neoliberal capital is based on abstraction of language. Today, in the age of digital abstraction, information has replaced things and bodies. Berardi ascribes a special role to art and poetry, which are able to return the body to language. I quote, "Poetry is singular vibration of the voice. The vibration can create resonances, and resonances may produce common space. Different voices that can create common knowledge is what we in our institution particularly wanted to underscore in the long-term project Glossary of Common Knowledge, which the Moderna Galerija is organizing as a part of International, a confederation of 7 European museums. Launched in 2010 in Ljubljana, the confederation has, among other things, assigned itself the task of working with neglected history, developing a common knowledge, opposing hegemonic position, and respecting horizontal collaboration. The glossary of common knowledge is being created as a transversal project that brings together narrators, that is, those who propose terms for the glossary, not only from the museums of international, but also from other contexts in various parts of the world. The glossary does serve as a kind of platform for translating between different socio-political and cultural contexts. Unlike other kinds of translation between different contexts, in the glossary project, this happens through the active participation of narrators who are physically present in separate seminars. So these seminars are devoted to different referential fields, such as historicization, geopolitics, subjectivization, other institutionality, the commons, and constituencies. At the seminars, each narrator presents a term that, in their view, best describes the given referential field. The referential fields are essentially umbrella terms, which in many cases come from the art world jargon, as I was talking before. And the narrators, with their own particular terms, give them a more individual and contextualized understanding. The term proposed by the narrator then enters a process of discussion, a kind of collective editing, through which it may be altered or at least made clearer. The title narrator, of course, is connected with oral histories, that is, with histories that have not yet been written down, at least not in the way histories have been written for those who have power over the written word. But here we are not speaking about some dichotomy between voice and the written word. After all, the terms that are proposed are themselves informed with the same contemporary alienation of language. Returning the body to language does not mean restoring the original source of language, but rather treating language as a social practice. What emerges from among different voices of the narrators is in fact the body of language. The narrator's voice is not the authentic voice, but rather a voice set in constant tension with other voices, as well as with writing. Understood in this way, the voice of narrator retains its point of utterance, which in our global world and its networks we must be ever more conscious of. As curators, we often face dilemmas about how to participate in global exhibitions without at the same time losing our point of utterance. Last year, I took a part in the project Hello World in the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. It examined about the role of museums, and German museums in particular, in the global world, of course. This enormous project was composed of 13 separately curated chapters devoted to different cultural contexts from all over the world. This also included the German context, as a large part of the project focused on self-reflection of National Gallery in Berlin in relation to its own museum policies and questions about how to move forward, how in the future it could more fully take into account non-Western world. I curated a chapter devoted to Eastern European art collectives, which I titled Sites of Sustainability, Pavilions, Manifestos, and Crypts. I presented mainly post-war avant-garde groups from the territory of former Yugoslavia, groups that had, through their work as collectives, developed a kind of parallel infrastructure, and through this, a certain sovereignty vis-à-vis the authorities, a kind of self-rule, or to put it better and more in keeping with Yugoslav political history, self-management. Artistic collectivism also meant allegiance to a common idea, an allegiance that in a socialist reality existed only on the declarative level. We could say that these art groups gave body to ideas of socialism that had been degenerated in political reality. Thus, collectivism acquired its own territory, a point I try to emphasize by installing the separate art collectives, like you can see from the beginning, the Croatian group Exat 51, Gorgona, New Tendencies, OHO, NSK, Neue Slowenische Kunst, and others. I can Gorgona, OHO. Each of the group in its own pavilion, which with a design that was based on the original ideas of the given group. The pavilions designed the relatively autonomous territories of these art collectives, which were possible only because these artists had worked on sustainable principles for collaboration, self-organization, their own economies, and local and international networks that, of course, they created. At the same time, these pavilions acted as metaphors for cynical way we approach the sovereignty of individual cultural spaces, which nobody really believes anymore, even though we continue to present such spaces as sovereign and distinct. The most obvious, of course, example is Venice Biennial. But this cynicism is found not only in the pragmatic manipulation and marketing of the cultural differences, it also lies in our tendencies to conceal why cultural spaces are in fact different. They are different primarily because of their material conditions and their relations to power. It is on this basis then that we should rethink the idea of the global museum, which the world's cultural capitals especially are striving to realize. And with the help of art from different spaces, we should show just how this world in fact operates, why there are differences between North and South, East and West, and why these differences are reproduced by global capitalism. In this way, the pavilion is a metaphor for a space that is not completely autonomous, but always exists in relation to some much bigger architectural structure, which in our case means the dominant social and economic system. The pavilion is a space where the powerful dump their problems, but it is also where different ideas can take shape and confront each other. When we at the Moderna Galerija began asking how we could engage in more equal exchange of ideas on the global level and do this from within conditions that in Slovenia are set by what is predominantly state funding and very low budgets. We discovered the answer precisely in the tradition of these local avant-gardes and their sustainability. One could say that our museum internalized these art group's principles of sustainability. So this was already shown. So the Moderna Galerija understands itself today as a sustainable, not global, but a sustainable museum. Perhaps this idea is more easily understood in relation to other existing museum models in this scheme, such as Global Museum, which replaced the Universal Museum. The last is the artistic project. The Sustainable Museum is a museum that has its own body. In other words, it has its own constituencies, its own local community with whom it constructs its context. And it has its own international networks, which developed on the basis of the similar visions of the partners involved. Here, the Confederation International is particularly important as a network of equal producers in which each of us speaks on our own behalf, and nobody represents anyone else. The Sustainable Museum is a museum that does not merely accumulate, but primarily processes the knowledge and experiences that are brought together in its space. Unlike the global model of the museum, which in its drive to collect art from the entire world will predictably become unsustainable, the Sustainable Museum is focused on the micropolitics of local-to-local dialogues. While the idea of the global world, given the size of this world, can only be a construct, the Sustainable Museum examines the differences between this construct and individual local realities, the differences between abstraction and individual bodies. Thank you.
I think we have time for just a couple questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
So time for a couple questions. There's microphones on either side of the... Yes, madam, there's one down here.
Thank you for an extraordinarily interesting talk. You've clearly gotten this weekend off to a great start. And I just want to add that I've admired your work from afar for a long time. It's a thrill to hear you speak live and in person. Let me ask a question about the tension between the abstract ideas of the global and the local and particularities of history. In the work, Art from Eastern Europe, is it possible for audiences outside of that region to understand it without a more intimate knowledge of the post-Yalta era or the post-1989 era that most Americans actually possess?
So if I understood you well, the question relates to the possibility to understand the local and how much it can be really local and how much it is abstract in a way that I was talking about. The local spaces are, you hear often, in this, let's say, marginalized spaces that only the local people can talk and understand the art from their spaces. And this is something that I understand as a reaction to this increased interest, that happened in the beginning of the 90s. Of course, it is impossible to understand the complexity, but it's also impossible for the local people to enter, in the local spaces we have many different antagonisms. So there are people from the same cultural environment that completely don't understand the things that are related to the avant-garde circles and so. And, there is especially in former Yugoslavia, I think, still split between the so-called modernist and post-avant-gardists. So the question how to approach and how to increase the visibility and understanding of this art spaces is of course it is difficult. We know there are many efforts, in the last 30 years, also CMAP and all the big museums in the West, they try to do something to increase, and of course we are aware about all the criticisms about the dangers, what this can mean. So it can be only the, something that increase the power of this main institution. But I think that all those projects, including the CMAP, they contributed a lot, to understanding. Of course, there are problems, there are difficulties, but still.
Thank you also for a very stimulating talk. I had a couple of related questions that came to mind as I was trying to reconstruct the logic of your presentation. You began with a kind of I think a necessary kind of abstract binarism of the global versus the local, and you suggested both the ability but also the limitations of the network model to both perpetuate but also overcome the hierarchies involved in the global and the local. On the one hand, the network subtends those kinds of binarisms by moving across space in ways that violate those kinds of hierarchies. On the other hand, they don't completely dislodge them. And then the logic of your talk went from this kind of moment of abstraction towards embodied local sovereignties. And I wanted you to, my first question would be to ask you to return to the problem of network and to rethink it in the light of what you have said at the very end. How would this alternative local-to-local dialogue function within the same circulatory model that on some level is prevalent both in a museum or art collective practices? Because I'm not sure you're suggesting something radically new in terms of the network model itself, but some kind of complex displacement within it. So that would be my first question. The second one is actually about the middle of your talk, where you moved in scale, in spatial scale, from the global to the local via the regional. Yes? And I think the regional is actually an immensely important geography to contemplate. And I'm wondering, the previous question was how to teach, for example, the history of the former Yugoslavia or the Eastern Bloc in ways that are pedagogically and aesthetically useful to museum goers in the United States, for example. And I'm wondering how to think about the specificity of the former Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc, and also to see it as part of a larger conversation. And one idea that comes to mind is alternative but also coeval histories of the modern, right? In which the experience, but coeval, like histories of the modern, in which the history of state socialism functions as a kind of memory which is being erased, not just in the West, but even, as you pointed out, in the former Yugoslavia. So those two questions, the regional, but also rethinking the network.
Thank you very much. Actually, the question of network, I try to trace also the case studies from our museum related to the question of network. So when I was talking about you asked me at the end of my paper about the collective practices, and how we in the museum incorporated actually their experience. It is exactly about, the same question, about the collaboration. So the answer, my dilemma at the beginning was, of course we know, networks are good and bad, and, this is the dominant mode of the production, and you can fight them only with an alternative networks. And the lesson I learned in socialist Yugoslavia was that you can fight let's say the generation of the system only by taking everything what was said on declarative level very seriously. And this is the same with the networks. So the glossary is also the network, the glossary of common knowledge. And it's also a proposal, how can we learn and teach about, the Eastern Europe or Asian, whatever, art. So my answer is actually through collaboration. So the glossary is a proposal for alternative way of translation. So you can translate only when you feel other body, when you are physically together. And there are dilemmas, and you ask, I know this is not always possible, but I think we need to use these models as much as possible.
Time for one more question.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I have a kind of probably very simple question, which is, given this move that you are suggesting for what used to be the global search of the museum towards a sustainable museum, and the search for collectivity, common practices, local, regional embodiment, forms of embodied translation, I wonder, why are we keeping the very category of museum? If it has traveled,
why not?
Yeah, maybe why not? But I mean, it's like we keep trying to transform it, and that term is a term that is so historically bound to a certain set of conditions, right? And we have been transforming it, and so it's temporally bound to history, much like the term, modern and contemporary are as well, right? And so on the one hand, it's a question of why do we keep the term museum, and on the second, it's how are you dealing with the fact that your space has those terms associated to them, right? Modern and contemporary.
Yeah. So you see here, the last circle is Meta Museum. This is the artistic project which proposed the cancellation of the museum. So to go beyond this institutional model, but. I have to be, as a museum director, more realistic, of course, a little bit utopian, but still. So I often...
could we call it something else? Could we imagine a space that is what museums used to be in different moments of history, and that maybe we keep or we don't keep the term, but we radically reconceptualize not only space, but time in it? So that we get rid of all these other categories that we're kind of dragging.
So I don't know whether you know Gerald Raunig, who writes a lot about these different institutional practices, instituent practices actually in his terms. So he talks about necessity to collaborate on a horizontal level with different agencies from the civil society. And I prefer to talk, coming again from my own experience and context, about the civil-public partnership, which would be my concrete proposal for a different museum. I think, and it also depends on the different contexts. I'm aware that here in Europe, something like this is impossible, but in Ljubljana, which is very small city, and we are almost completely depending on the state budget, as all NGOs in our case mostly. So this is the condition that enable us to collaborate more, and we really collaborate a lot. So that's why I also talk about sustainable museum. That depends very much on its constituencies, and so this civil-public partnership is something that has been discussed a lot also in the other cities in former Yugoslavia. In Zagreb, you have nice examples of these practices, and this can be something that institution can still survive So it is about more about again institution in becoming then institutionalized institution idea.
Because what you were describing towards the end sounded very much like a laboratory in a way.
Yeah, but with whom? Yeah, so if it is only the laboratory of the experts, then it should be really this horizontal, beyond experts, division, collaboration.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you all for coming. I hope some of you or all of you will join us tomorrow and Sunday. And let's all give a big round of applause for Zdenka Badovinac.